You know, I am a huge fan of aliens, alien pop culture, obviously. I grew up watching The X-Files. I love all things alien and silly and weird, and it's just marvelous. Marvelous. But it is a culture. It's a pop culture thing. It's not that I believe in aliens having been discovered at Roswell and government cover-ups and all that. It's not that. Oddly enough, I tend to be a bit more skeptical. It's that I just love the pop culture. It's fun. And I do think aliens exist, of course. Like, no way. No way. Billions and billions of planets. No way all those Earth-like planets out there. Planets capable of sustaining all sorts of other types of life forms. No way there's not other living organisms of some kind on other planets. But I don't think that that's what happened here. I don't personally believe that aliens crash landed on our planet. I have so many other ulterior theories to that, but focusing on the Roswell crash, I do believe there was a crash and I do believe there was a cover-up. But I believe that there were reasons for this that had absolutely nothing to do with aliens. In fact, I think that my beloved alien pop culture was more or less intended as a distraction. It was perpetrated by the government to distract us and keep us happy and keep us accusing the government of covering up aliens rather than covering up what I believe they did cover up. To be fair, I do not think that the US government, any of the governments of the time, chose to lie to the people or cover up what happened for reasons that some may think unscrupulous, reasons that would be just to deceive the people and manipulate and control the people. I don't think that was it. I don't think there was any malice behind it. I think they had good intentions. So I'm just gonna get into it. Roswell happened 2 years after Japan signed the treaty with the US government. It happened, just a few years after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. If they could hit Pearl Harbor, they could hit the mainland. This was always a concern. Just prior to the Roswell crash, there had been numerous other supposed UFO sightings. Ancient astronaut theorists will tell you that these were all UFO sightings and that the government said that, everybody was just on edge due to just after World War II, everybody still looking in the skies for that sort of thing. And it was just a lot of uneasy nerves, and ancient astronaut theorists will tell you that it was aliens keeping an eye on us because we dropped nukes. But I don't think it was aliens, and I don't think it was nerves. I think the sightings off the coast of California were legit. I think some of the other sightings that predated Roswell were also of the same nature. I think the Roswell crash was in fact a kamikaze who was just a wee bit off his mark. And the reason I think this is because this wasn't like the world today where something happens and immediately everybody, we've got live footage, we've got social media, everybody's on it, everybody knows. No. The treaty may have been signed And the governments may have been in communication and trying to work things out, but there were still soldiers fighting decades after the war ended. There were soldiers who were still fighting and did not know. They were still finding soldiers in Iwo Jima in the 70s who had no clue that it had been over for so many years. So you got to think, in order for the Japanese to bomb Pearl Harbor in the first place, they had to get close enough. They had to have subs out there. They had to have a means of getting out that way. And they had to have a plan for getting to the mainland as well. So, and these weren't soldiers that were under the Emperor's orders, by the way. These were a renegade group under General Tojo. These were misguided, fearful individuals who they Tojo and his men, they were tried for war crimes. To not get into anything political, this particular group that I'm referring to probably would not have had the updated information. They probably would not have been aware that the war had ended, or if they were aware, maybe they had already gone against the Emperor's orders and the Admiral's orders. They had already done what they'd done, and maybe they were still following their own ideology. So think of it as this. They probably were out of the loop. So while the treaty had been signed and the war had been over, there were probably still rogue attacks happening, probably all over the world, probably different countries, still rogue attacks happening from enemies all over. But in this case, for the sake of argument, we're looking specifically at Roswell and that crash, and the reasons why I think it may have been a rogue Japanese kamikaze. For one thing, Roswell, the area of Roswell where the crash occurred is a stone's throw away from Walker Air Force Base. It's about 5 miles away. So, I mean, you can make the argument, well, they missed by 5 miles. If they missed their mark, that's quite a bit. Well, maybe not. Different times. And depending on the circumstances, depending on how off their information was, depending on how off their instruments may have been, depending on how disoriented the pilot was, a number of things could have occurred there. But I think they were aiming for Walker Air Force Base. And the reason I think this is because that is the Air Force Base that had all of the experimental nuclear weapon research happening at the time and had deployed the nuclear bombs that were dropped. I do think it was a rogue attack. I do think that, considering the devastation and the fear and the overall panic and just everything that the world had been through during World War II, and that the world was under post-traumatic stress, okay? Like, the post-traumatic effects of any little thing. Everybody's nerves are on edge, any little threat, and the panic and the consequences that, people were still recovering, people were still rebuilding. There was no way any government was going to risk going back into all-out war again over instances of rogue attacks from groups that were not sanctioned by the government. I'm fairly certain that, the U.S. and Japan would have been in conversation about how to deal with this, and there would have been agreements between the two governments. And in order to maintain the peace and the newly established treaty and to not face any more devastation on either side, cover-ups would have occurred. And it would have been best for all parties involved. I'm all for the truth, but in this instance, I can understand why the world governments in general would not have wanted to spark the flames of war all over again. I can understand why they would have thought it best to protect the people from knowing that sort of truth and give them something else to focus on. So, yeah, the government's the bad guy. Your own government that you just fought for just became the bad guy because they're covering up aliens, because that's something that the public can get good and distracted by. And look what a phenomenal pop culture event that has become. Look what all came about that. And honestly, the government's probably made a great deal of money off of that too. So, works out for everybody. That's probably the best outcome of that situation. And honestly, the initial report from Roswell, it wasn't, the Walker Air Force Base had sent officers to deal with the situation. They were aware of it and sent officers. But, back in this time period, again, communication was not instantaneous. And I have from very reliable sources who were in the military branches of both U.S. and Japanese military branches of the time. Not only was communication between governments difficult at the time period, but military branches belonging to the same government did not want to share information. It was like a contest. I'm just going to come out and say it. What I was told in the exact words of the Air Force officers who worked during those time periods, they told me that part of the reason why a lot of things happened during that time period is because there was a lack of cooperation between the military branches, because they didn't like anybody from another military branch pissing in their sandbox, is how they put it. So that there was competition between like the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, all of that for the U.S. government, at the very least, is what I have been told from military veterans of that time period. So, Walker Air Force Base sent Air Force officers who were familiar with what was going on and the situation. They were well versed in all of that. They were well versed in keeping track of potential attacks and sightings, and they were well versed in, of course, the research that they had been doing and why they might be a target. They were heading out to that crash, but the Army got there first. And of course, the Army did not have that intel. And what they saw, whether it be an actual, crashed Japanese airship wreckage, whatever may have occurred, or even if Walker Air Force Base was experimenting with something new, which more than likely was not a weather balloon, and more than likely not even a weather balloon with nukes, despite the fact that they were working with nuclear experiments. More than likely, if it was something out of Walker that went astray and it was an oops on their part, it might have been a top secret experimental weapon, and to this day is probably still classified. But either way, the Army did not have that information. So they could have easily made the mistake of thinking that it was extraterrestrial life forms crashing into the planet. They could have made that mistake. That could have been an honest oops that maybe the government just ran with afterward and said, well, you know what? That's an excellent cover story. Let's let the people think that we're trying to cover up, like, visitations from other planets. Yeah, that's what we're doing. So, it may be that, when the army got there and they saw the wreckage, they couldn't identify what they were seeing. Some of you might be thinking, well, they would have known what Japanese kamikaze looked like. They would have known what a human body looks like. Well, not necessarily. Have you ever seen what a human body can become after it's sustained that kind of damage, like an explosion and all that burning? The bodies may have appeared to be small. They may have shriveled up due to the damage. There's just no way of knowing what they actually saw when they got there, because we don't genuinely have photos of the bodies. There's an awful lot of fakes floating around, but we do not have, they didn't really have photos of the bodies. I'm almost certain of it. Almost certain of it. But if they did in fact identify the bodies in a crash, if there was a crash and there were bodies and they identified them as Japanese, they would have more than likely done everything in their power to keep that silent. And I don't know whether they would have negotiated with Japan to send the bodies home, because it may be that Japan did not want the bodies back. Typically, an act of courtesy would have been to return the bodies, maybe keep the wreckage and study the technology. But it may be that due to the dishonor, Japan didn't want the bodies back. So, no real way of knowing what exactly happened there. But I do believe that the most likely scenario is that this was a post-war attack aimed towards the nuclear base that dropped the bombs, deployed the bombs, and in order to prevent widespread panic and chaos, and in order to prevent inciting war all over again, everything was in a very fragile state at the time. I do think the governments would have conspired together, agreed to cover it up. And I do think in order to distract the people and give them something else to move on from the war and get away from the war, especially with all the fear and panic and the sightings that were occurring, I do think the government either would have outright fabricated, like maybe it was completely planned. Maybe they meant to give the newspaper that information and then, oops, no, we misspoke, and make it seem like a blunder on their part when really it was completely scripted and planned out. Maybe they did it entirely on purpose and went with it to distract the people. And maybe some of that was also done as a test. They were curious as to how the American people would react if extraterrestrial life was ever discovered, because hey, at this point, Operation Paperclip had already happened. They were working on rockets, they were working on space programs, they were working on all that stuff, so they were curious. So I would not doubt in an instant that the American government was capable of, okay, well, how do we deal with this attack? How do we keep the American people from finding out that we're still vulnerable and that there are still some rogue attacks happening despite having signed the treaty with Japan? Well, we're interested in space. People are showing more and more of an interest in the possibility of discovering life on other planets. Let's run with that. This was not a rogue Japanese attack. This was aliens. And it worked. Boy, did it work. We have had quite a few decades of pop culture and chaos and marvelous, marvelous alien books and movies and media, and it's just fantastic. I love it. I love it. But unfortunately, I don't believe that aliens crashed at Roswell. And although my sources could not give me much and could not outright verify everything, They were quite helpful as beta readers for my book. When they got to that chapter, they were quite helpful in reaffirming my suspicions. They, some of them did not say a word at all, just smiled at me and gave that nod. One of them wrote the word yes next to a particular paragraph, and another told me I was on the right track. So I am confident in this particular theory that it was in fact a post-war rogue attack directed towards the Air Force Base, and that the governments were in communication with one another and did cooperate and maintain peace and do right by the people and prevent widespread panic and prevent a new war from inciting. And ultimately, I can't fault the governments for covering that up. So I also can't fault the government for creating a marvelous pulp culture with the whole alien thing. Like that is just the best thing to have come out of that. I am just envious that I didn't live during that time period to get to enjoy all of the crazy and the chaos for Roswell. Can you imagine me, the person who loves fringe theories and speculation and asking so many questions and just having a good old time with all of the... Just... I missed out. It's just a shame. I missed all the fun. But considering everything that I've said here in this video and considering everything that I've written in that blog and in the book, I go into far more details. I give some alternative theories as well, but I specify in detail how this could have occurred and some of the other sightings, and of course how the governments may have proceeded after the fact. So if you're not offended by any of this and you're interested in reading more about that and looking further into this matter, check out the blog, check out my book. There's an entire chapter, it's called Roswell, New Mexico, in my book, which is available ebook download on Amazon. Try to be open-minded. I know a lot of emotions are still kind of fresh, even in my generation, the current generations. There's a lot of heavy feelings there. As someone who is Japanese, but who is also Canadian and American. I know. I can promise you this is not an easy subject matter to talk about in general. World War II is not an easy subject matter for me to talk about in general, but people need to be able to put their personal feelings aside and not let all of that pain and trauma and stress and hatred from previous generations that were passed down. Some of it is being taught to the newer and younger generations, and people need to be able to put that aside and look at it historically and look at it objectively and be able to have conversations about what may or may not have occurred. And in this situation, I think it's best to consider the cooperation and the wisdom between the two governments. If these rogue attacks were still occurring and the two governments were able to overcome what they had just put each other through and all of that pain, those wounds were still wide open. They were able to overcome that and agree not to go back into war, not to panic the people, but to give the people something else to distract them from what had just occurred, some means of healing. You know, it's kind of like that whole my enemy is my friend thing. But in this case, I guess they didn't really fabricate an enemy. They weren't necessarily saying that, oh, aliens are coming to attack us now. They weren't making up an enemy, but they were inventing a third party to be concerned about, but more of a pulp culture and just a fun sort of thing. I mean, yeah, sure, were people concerned and people worried? And of course they were. People were still very much afraid of the way the world was changing, and the nuclear weapons that we had possessed now and all of these things. But really, I feel like a lot of people in that time period did have a good time with that and did run with that and were more interested in going to space and seeing what was out there. So I do think it was a good thing. I do think it helped with the healing process and helped distract the population of the entire world, really. The space race was on and the entire world was distracted when that occurred, and it was necessary because we entered a nuclear period of fear. So I can't fault the governments. Instead, I can only admire the efforts they made to keep the peace and to get through it. So that is what I take from it. And I was trying to avoid being political in any way. I hope I was objective and didn't upset or offend anyone. But yeah, that is my theory on what actually occurred at Roswell. And if you like this video, give me a like, give me a share, subscribe, check out my blogs, check out my book if you really want to read more, and stay extra, my fellow terrestrials.